Good evening. Come sit down and get comfortable by the fire while I read you a bedtime story. Today, I will be telling you about the history of dragons in Final Fantasy XIV. Feel free to close your eyes, cuddle up in a blanket, and drift off to sleep if that is what you wish. First, let's take a few deep breaths so we can relax ourselves. Breathe in. And breathe out. Breathe in. And breathe out. Last one. Breathe in. And breathe out. Let us begin our story. Dragons as a species originated in the far-off planet known only as the Dragon Star. Known as one of the strongest species in the universe, dragons lived among the planet's peaks in peace until they were attacked by a mechanical species known as the Omicrons. The Omicrons were an expansionary and invasive species that would subjugate planets for resources in an effort to evolve further as a precautionary measure to eliminate threats to their continued existence. Seeing the dragons as the biggest threat to them, the Omicron invaders laid siege to the star, leading a protracted war against the dragons. During this period, dragon specimens were captured and studied by the Omicron Stigma 4 in an effort to learn of the dragon's adaptive evolution, being controlled and forcibly turned into mechanical hybrids to attack their own kind. This war eventually ended when the planet was rendered uninhabitable for new life, with newly hatched dragonettes being malformed and suffering. At this point, remaining dragons were visited by the Enteleki Medion, who recorded their despair. Among the dragons of the Dragon Star was the great worm Midgard-Sormr, who, much to the scorn of his peers, fled the star with 7 of his unhatched eggs, pursued by the Omicron's greatest weapon, Omega, who he had fought to a standstill before. Flying through the great expanse of the Sea of Stars, Midgard-Sormr eventually reached the planet Hydaelyn, where he entreated with the divinity of the same name, who allowed him and his children to take refuge on the star. And tasked Midgard-Sormr with protecting Silvertear Lake. With his children's future secured, the great worm laid in deep slumber in Mordona. The newly hatched first brood eventually spread throughout the world, siring broods of their own, establishing new communities, often coming into contact with the mortals who populated the world, with 2 of the largest settlements of dragons being in Dravania to the northwest of Aldenard and the southern continent of Miracidia. A millennia later, when the languishing mortal Allegan Empire's first emperor, Zonde, was resurrected by the scientist Amon, he began an expansion toward Miracidia, where the great worms Tiamat and Bahamut of the first brood had made their home and spawned their own brood. The Allegan Empire attacked these dragons, and through the use of etherochemistry and advanced war machina, eventually killed Bahamut. Through the machinations of the Ashians, a shadowy cabal that wished to resurrect their sealed god Zodiarch by causing calamities on the star, Tiamat was convinced to summon a corrupted primal of her late brother-mate, under the impression that it would resurrect him. Given power by the dragon's worship, this dreadworm Bahamut instead tempered the dragons that summoned it. However, thanks to the Ashians, the Allegans were given the means to capture the primal, deploying the Omicron Omega, who had crash-landed on the planet and was unearthed by them. With Bahamut sealed away in Dalamat, the Allagans conquered and enslaved the Mericidian dragons, cruelly experimenting with them until the empire fell during an umbral calamity orchestrated by the Ashians. During the full-scale conflict with the Allagan Empire before its fall, the great worms Richa and Ashdaya heeded Tiamat's call for help and fought against the void-sent servants that the Allagan Empire summoned from the void, whereupon Ashdaya entered one of the void gates in an effort to stop the empire, seeing herself trapped in the void. 1,200 years before the 7th astral era, conflicts between the Dravanian horde and Ishgardian Elezen of Kurthus escalated. Of these two factions, the great worm Hraesvelgr and Saint Shiva fell in love. In hopes of always being together, Shiva allowed Hraesvelgr to consume her body and soul. With this sacrifice, the conflicts between the two factions stopped and the mortals communed with the dragons for 200 years, casting monuments, communities, and living harmoniously with each other. However, when the great worm Ratatoskr confided with King Thordan I of her brother Nidhogg's disdain for the Ishgardians, King Thordan and his Knights 12 descended upon her and slayed the great worm, consuming her eyes and essence in an effort to protect themselves from Nidhogg. Enraged by this trespass, Nidhogg fought Thordan and his knights, slaying the king and many of his knights before losing both his eyes to them. In impotent rage, Nidhogg entreated Hraesvelgr to confer one of his eyes to him as a penance for trusting in the Elezen Nidhogg had long believed were untrustworthy. With his newly recovered strength, Nidhogg thus rallied the Dravanian horde to fight against the Ishgardians in what would become known as the Dragon Song War. During that time, Nidhogg orchestrated the war in such a manner that would never let Ishgardians have periods of peace, collectively punishing the entire people of Kurthus. As the Garlean Empire began its conquest of Aldenard during the waning 6th Astral Era, the 14th Imperial Legion mobilized the Agrius, their largest airship, through Mordona, headed towards the rest of Eorzea after conquering Alamigo. However, as the warship flew above Silvertear Falls, the great worm Midgard-Sormr rose from the lake, and with its roar called for the Dravanian horde to mobilize against the warship and its attached war machina. During this fight, the worm managed to bring down the airship, but in the process caused the eruption of its ceruleum supplies, being consumed within the explosion and seemingly dying, with his corpse decorating the center of Mordona, known now as the Keeper of the Lake. Following this invasion's failure, the Garlean Empire employed the 7th Imperial Legion to attempt to call down Dalamat to attempt to raise Eorzea, but instead freed the primal Bahamut, who'd grown incredibly powerful in the millennia since his imprisonment, powered both by the energy acquired from the sun and the continued worship of captured Mericidian dragons in the binding coils of Bahamut. However, rather than causing a long age of darkness and bringing about a long-standing 6th Umbral Era, with the sacrifice of Louis-Soix Levier, Bahamut was defeated before causing irreparable damage, leading to a 5-year-long Umbral Era. During the late 6th Astral Era, the Elezen Yzael Tangulam, a walker, came upon Hraesvelgr in Kurthus and experienced an echo vision of Saint Shiva and Hraesvelgr. Believing this vision a revelation from Hydaelyn, Yzael joined the heretics, a splinter of Ishgardians who sided with the dragons and still worshipped Saint Shiva, and took the name Lady Iceheart, learning how to summon a primal version of Shiva into herself, believing that she was summoning the spirit of the saint herself. As the Dragon Song War came to its head, the Warrior of Light was joined by Lady Iceheart, Alphinaud Levier, and the current Azure Dragoon, Estinian Wormblood, as they ventured into Dravania to plead with Hraesvelgr for peace between Dravanians and Ishgardians. Revealing the long-buried truth of the conflict's origins and that the primal Iceheart summoned was not the real Shiva, the group grew disillusioned that they could achieve lasting peace between their peoples. Following these revelations, Estinian and the Warrior of Light struck down Nidhogg in the Eyrie, discovering through the echo that Nidhogg's remaining eye belonged to Hraesvelgr. Wishing to make known the truth of the war now that its main adherent was slain, the group was rebuffed by the Archbishop Thordan VII and the Heavens Ward, who, thanks to Ashian machinations, were able to turn into primal versions of King Thordan I and his Knights 12. Following Thordan to Azislaw, the group was accosted by the Garleans' 6th Imperial Legion, but were saved by Hraesvelgr and Ysael, the latter of which sacrificed herself to defeat the Imperials. Using one of the eyes of Nidhogg attached to the corpse of Haldrath, and drinking of the essence the warring triad imprisoned in Azislaw, Thordan wished to continue their holy war against the dragons, but he and his compatriots were struck down by the Warrior of Light. Following the death of the Archbishop, Estinian gathered both eyes of Nidhogg and became possessed by Nidhogg's shade, his rage and will surviving in his blood-soaked armor and ether-filled eyes. With Thordan and Nidhogg both dead, peace talks were attempted by Ishgardians and the dragons living in Aenig's shrine, but were interrupted by the shade of Nidhogg that desired only vengeance. Once more mounting in offensive against Ishgard, Nidhogg fought against Hraesvelgr, who had been convinced by the Warrior of Light to fight for peace between their peoples. Finally facing the Warrior of Light, empowered by one of Hraesvelgr's eyes, Nidhogg's shade was cast out of Estinian's body by the warrior and Alphino with the help of the spirit of the departed Ysael. With Nidhogg's eyes separated from Estinian's body, they were cast from the steps of faith, with the belief that the torrent of unstable ether at the bottom of the chasm would keep them out of reach from meddling hands. However, the Ashian Elidibus obtained the eyes and orchestrated their use to summon the primal Shinryu. Following the death of Nidhogg, cooperation between Dravanians and mortals increased. With the aid of the Mogmenders and the Warrior of Light, areas in the churning mists were restored to their previous splendor. After the young child, Meili Greystone was rescued from certain death by Vidofnir, Ishgardian opinions on dragons improved. With the creation of the firmament, transfigured former heretics were allowed to return to their families, and dragonettes and other dragons were allowed to visit and live among the peoples of Ishgard. Some time before the return of the final days, the great worm Tiamat was freed from tempering by the scions of the Seventh Dawn's efforts and freed from her ancient Allegan fetters. Following her freedom, Tiamat gathered the remains of her brood in Eorzea and returned to Mericidia. Having long abandoned hope of rescuing his sister, Ashdaya, from the void of the 13th, Vritra had long since founded the city-state of Razadhan, acting as satrap for the mortals there, considering them his brood. However, when the aid of the former scions, Vritra's hopes were renewed as he ventured deep into the void to rescue his sister, who was held captive by Golbez, a void sent bent on opening a void gate to the source to bring salvation to the 13th. Finally, reasoning with Golbez that he did not have to damn others to try and save his people with the aid of the half-void sent Zero, Vritra was able to save Ashdaya by sacrificing one of his eyes, introducing her to their new home. And that is where the current timeline of the history of dragons comes to an end. I hope that you found this story relaxing. Let me know if you would like to hear more. Sweet dreams.